even though both are developing countries. And if you think about the economic growth that developing countries are experiencing, there is a significant difference as well. So then we were supposed to. So then we were supposed to talk about. I think I
Sir,
mentioned.
sorry to interrupt you. You didn't actually discuss point 10 there. Like, could you just talk about that a little bit?
Which one?
The point 10, I guess, the last point we were discussing regarding the characteristics of the developing world.
Right. We talked about this stuff. Which one are you
The
talking about?
last one, so the colonial legacy and external dependence.
Okay, so colonial legacy so basically, if you think about the colonial legacy, for example, so most of the developing countries that you see, most of these countries were some form of colonies of mostly the European powers, right? For example, UK or Spain or uh, Dutch or German or Belgium or France. So there were lots of European powers that actually colonized many of the current developing countries. Now, when it comes to the type of colony that they established, this type of colony differs between countries. If you think about USA, Australia, New Zealand versus South Africa or Indian subcontinent, for example, there is a significant difference in the type of colonies that um, they established. So in North America or Australia or countries like that, they have established colonies where so there are two types of colonies mainly, if you think about it. One is settlers colony, the places where they wanted to settle. So those places ended up with better institutions, better private property rights, taxations, and other types of things. For example, in African countries, for example, the colonial rulers did not want to settle there. These countries, the disease environment were extremely harsh, or the environment were extremely harsh to them, in the sense that these countries are I mean, the tropical countries mostly. It was difficult for them to establish a settlers colony here because the mortality rate in this sort of or African countries, for example, are quite high. For mortality rates for the colonists or settlers. So people, these tropical regions had um, relatively the tropical regions have some diseases, indigenous diseases that are relatively harmless, not exactly harmless, I mean, not fatal to the indigenous people, but for the colonists or the people who came to settle here, or the British or Dutch or French people, it was quite harmful, deadly to them. So the mortality rate of the settlers were quite high in the tropical areas compared to relatively temperate zone, for example, North America or Australia or New Zealand. So they set up so in South African countries or Indian subcontinent, their policy or the type of colony that they established was um, to facilitate the extraction of resources from these places. Whereas in North America or Australia, in this type of places, they established colonies with good institutions because they wanted to settle there. As a result, these places, as you can see, there are some papers on this. So North America or places where colonial rulers wanted to settle, these places had better economic institutions or better institutions that ensure property rights, or have better tax policies and things like that, versus this tropical region where they established colonies where they wanted to extract resources from there. So they instituted, or they've they have established institutions that will facilitate the extraction of resources. So kind of bad institution. So that actually later on determine what type, whether a country is going to have, um, whether the country is going to be rich or relatively poor. Okay.
Okay, sure. So the colonial legacy, is it just a type
What
of
type of
toxicity
colony
by
they
the country,
established?
or is it like, can we consider SARC in it, as in like they try to form an organization to be a colony?
Can you repeat that, please?
I mean, sir, like, can we consider SARC as an outcome of it, as it like they wanted to be in a colony, the South Asian countries, and that's why they are.
No, 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 no. No one wanted to be a colony, I think. But so colony means, the British. So the Indian subcontinent was a British colony, right?
Yes, sir.
So the colonial legacy we are talking about. So what happened like 200-300 years ago? What type of colony they established? So British people had colonies, French people, France had colonies, Belgium had colonies, Germany had colonies, Spain had colonies. So a lot of European powers had colonies, and from some places they wanted to extract resources, meaning take away the resources that the European powers need to facilitate their industrialization process, for example. And in some places where they wanted to settle, meaning they want to live there. So if you think about North America, that is that would be a settler. That would be colony where they wanted to settle. Australia or New Zealand, these are the places where these European powers wanted to live, wanted to settle. So there are two types of colonies: settler colonies and non-settler colonies. In settler colonies, they had good institutions. In non-settler colonies, they wanted to extract resources, so they had bad institutions.
Okay, sir, I understand, sir.
So there are significant. So I hope you read these characteristics or these features that makes a big difference between the currently developing countries versus the developed countries in the earlier stages of development. So there are significant differences in physical and human capital, the climate, population size. For example, population size in the Western countries or in the currently developed countries, it was population growth rate was not really that high in these countries versus currently developing countries had extremely high, at some point they had extremely high population growth rate. Um, then historic role of international migration plays a significant role as well. For example, if you think about USA, Australia, um, international migration helped these countries to grow, because at some point USA or North America needed more manpower, more labor. At that time, there was a huge migration of people from Europe to the North America that facilitated the development of both sides. International trade benefits at that time. International trade benefited them immensely. And if you think about scientific and technological research, they had that capability. So if you think about Newton, for example, Newton, uh, or not just Newton, they had this Royal Society of, if you think about UK, they had this Royal Society of Scientists where they did research, scientific research and innovation that helped them grow economically in the future periods. And tried to establish better economic institutions, which is quite different from the currently developing world, which mainly inherited bad institutions in many cases from the colonial rulers. Now, this is an important question. This is one of the things that we try to address. So if you look at I think I showed you at the beginning of the discussion here. So there is, are countries converging, are the standard of living in countries converging? So are living standards of developing and developed nations converging? Means, are you saying, let's say for example, if we use income as standard of living, per capita income, for example, if developed countries have income like at this level, and developing countries, let's say like this level, are they converging to this one? So this is an important question, and obviously, if we go back to the beginning of the discussions, you can see it doesn't look like the gap was relatively smaller here than here, right? So China and some other countries are kind of doing quite well in terms of moving towards the developed world. But for most of the developing countries, this is not the case that you see from the diagram. So there are two types of convergence that we can talk about. Mainly two types. One is absolute country convergence. Another is um, relative country convergence. So absolute country convergence would mean the gap between developed and developing countries, standard of living or per capita income, the gap between per capita income, uh, the gap in per capita income between developed and developing countries are getting smaller. For example, let's say if we had, hold on a second, I should flip it so I can write. So if you think, let's say for example, we have 1970 versus let's say 2020, country A, and we have country B. So if you think about, suppose country A has 20,000, suppose country A has $15,000. Let me use some easier number to deal with. Country A had $20,000 in 1970, and let's say $70,000 today. Okay, maybe I should do, let's say 10,000 versus $60,000, and country B had 100 versus, let's say 1,000. So if you look at the gap here between these two countries were how much? It was only about 9,900 was the gap, right? Between these two, the gap is 59,000. So do you see absolute country convergence would mean, so we in this case we do not see absolute country convergence. We do not see absolute convergence or unconditional convergence, meaning, but we would have absolute convergence, for example, if we had, let's say, instead of this, if this country had, let's say, for example, 55,000. So in that case, the gap would be how much? 5,000, right? So that would be absolute country convergence. But that is, we would probably see, if you remember the graph that we just saw, the gap probably was much bigger, right? The gap went bigger. So
Sir, can you explain the term absolute convergence again? Like,
so
what does it mean?
absolute convergence basically means that the gap between country A and country B in absolute, so the gap between these two in absolute number of the value of their absolute value of the income, the gap is getting smaller. That would be absolute country convergence.
Got it, sir. And relative
So
means
this
like,
would be, so this would be
okay,
if we have, so this is absolute country convergence. So the gap initially was 9,900, now it is just 5,000. So they are converging in absolute term. And
got
relative
it, sir.
country, uh, but if we had something like this, we do not see absolute country convergence. However, how about relative country convergence? So relative country convergence, if you think about it, so for example, this one versus this one. So if you divide 10,000, what is the ratio here? So 10,000 divided by 100 is equal to how much? 10, right?
Yes, sir. Fine.
Oh, sorry, 100.
So 100.
100, sir.
So 100. But the ratio here, how much? 60,000
60.
divided by 1,000, that's 60, right?
Yes, sir.
So in 70, country A's income was 100 times the income of country B. In 2020, even though there is no absolute country convergence, the income of country A is only 60 times the income of country B, right? So what do you think? Are they converging in relative sense?
Sir, does relative here mean like it's better than the previous year?
We are not comparing. So we are comparing the relative position of country A and country B during these two periods.
Yes, sir, that's what I'm asking. Like absolute one, like there the numbers or figures were coming really closer, but here I think it's not that much. So I'm getting a bit confused in this case.
So in relative sense, in the 70s, country A's income was 100 times country B's income. In 2020, country A's income is only 60 times the income of country B. So that means the ratio wise, the gap is getting smaller, right?
Yes, sir.
100 times versus 60 times, which one is better? Obviously 60 times.
60
In
times.
terms of in terms of equality, getting closer, this is better, right? So we
Yes,
have, in this example, we have relative country convergence. So relative country convergence also basically means here that the growth rate of country A was less than the growth rate of country B. So if you think about it, the growth rate was how much? The country B is growing at a faster rate than country A. So relative country convergence would basically mean that richer countries are going to grow at a slower rate. Poorer countries are going to grow at a faster rate than the richer countries. That would indicate relative country convergence. Okay, any confusion here?
Sir,
Yeah, I can
hello.
hear you.
Sir, can you repeat the last line again
So
about the relative convergence?
relative country convergence basically means poorer countries will be growing at a faster rate than the richer countries. Okay.
Yes, I got it.
and sir, absolute convergence means that the gap is getting lower day by day.
In absolute country convergence,
Yes.
the absolute gap between these two is going to get smaller.
Okay, got it, sir.
Now, when it comes to relative country convergence, at the initial stage, the absolute gap might go up. If we, even in the presence of relative country convergence, absolute gap might go up, but at some point it is going to get smaller. So if you see relative country convergence, initially there might not be absolute country convergence, but we will have absolute country convergence sometime in the future. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
All right. So let's take a look at the graphs. So if you look at this graph, this is this graph is comparing the growth rate of countries. So in practice, we don't really see absolute country we don't have evidence of absolute country convergence. Okay. So let's see what happens to if you look at the data, you will see. Again, let me go back to this graph. So if you look at this, these are developed countries. So if you compare these developed countries with the developing world, so we don't really see absolute country convergence. So we had smaller gap in terms of dollar value. Now the gap is larger, right? For
Yes.
China, the gap probably was even bigger somewhere here, but it's getting smaller. But for most of the developing countries, or almost all the developing countries, that probably except for China or something, some other countries like that. Um, Maybe absolute. We might. Excuse me. We might see some evidence of absolute country convergence. Generally, we don't see absolute country convergence. The gap is getting bigger, or gap currently in current years is bigger than the earlier years. But in when it comes to relative country convergence, we might actually see some evidence of relative country convergence. However, um, let's check with some data. So the graph that we have in the textbook, the graphs are a little old. Here in this graph, we are comparing. On the horizontal axis, we have real income per capita. On the vertical axis, we have average annual growth rate, okay, of real GDP per capita. So if you plot the growth rate against the level of income that these countries have in 1990, so we're basically comparing the annual average growth rate from 1980 to 2007. So if you look at this growth rate, average annual growth rate, so what we see is it looks like a scatter plot. I mean, we don't really see any strong relationship here. It looks just like a scatter plot with going up and down and so on. No pattern. We don't see any pattern here. So this is for 157 countries, includes both developing and developed countries. Now what we can do is, okay, let's separate them. So we are going to look at developing and developed countries. So if we look at the developing countries, so again, on the horizontal axis, we have per capita income in 1980, and on the vertical axis, we have growth rate. So if we plot the data, what we see again, it's the opposite of country convergence. Okay, there's a line which slopes slightly upward, which is indicating if a country started with a relatively higher income in 1980, their growth rate would be relatively higher today, which is the opposite of relative country convergence. That means among the developing countries, relatively richer countries are growing at a faster rate than the poorer countries. So we do not have relative country convergence here. We do not have relative country convergence here. So let's see what we get for the developed countries. Now, if you just look at the currently developed countries, not exactly currently in 2000 developed countries in 2007. So here we're comparing numbers in 1950 to 2007. So on the horizontal axis, this time we have income per capita in 19 or GDP per capita or income per capita in 1950. Now we want to see what happened to growth rate. On the vertical axis, we have the annual average growth rate from 1952 to 2007. If you look at this growth rate, what we see here is a downward sloping line, which indicate that there are some evidence of relative country convergence. Meaning, if a country in 1950 was poorer, that country would be growing at a faster rate. If a country in 1950 was relatively richer, somewhere at the year, those countries will be growing at a slower rate. So there is a downward sloping line here, indicating that we see some form of we see some evidence of relative country convergence among the developed countries, but it is absent for the developing countries. So we cannot really rely on this one just to say, okay, the countries are converging. So if you isolate them, if you separate the developed countries from the list, we do not see any evidence of relative country convergence in the data. Questions?
No, sir.
So the relative country, we don't have any strong evidence of relative country convergence. Now, if you think about China, for example, China in 1980, China's income, per capita income in 1980, so China's per capita income in 1980 was only 3% of US per capita income or per capita GDP. Now, that's about 14%. So if you compare USA versus China, do you think we have relative country convergence between these two? China's income in 2007, for example, not exactly 2007. Let's say, for example, a couple. So the data that we have, it's a little bit old, but let's say the data is around 2010. So in around 2010, China's per capita income was about 14% of the US per capita income. Do you think it indicates relative country convergence? Yes, it does, because China is growing at a much faster rate than the US. That is why their income, the income, Chinese income is now China has a larger share of US. If you compare with USA, China has income is relatively larger um, as a share of the US income, as a proportion of US income. If you
Yeah,
look
what
at
about USA? Like you said that relative country convergence is something when like poorer countries will go at a faster rate than rich countries. So like has USA stopped growing? Are you indicating that?
no, USA is still growing, but poorer countries are growing at a faster rate. That would indicate relative country convergence. So, for example, China over the last 3-4 decades, China was growing nearly on average, probably 8 7 8%. Okay, China was growing nearly around 7 8% on average in last almost 3 or 4 decades. And USA probably was growing at around 2% or maximum 3% on average. So that would indicate China is growing at a faster rate. China is a poorer country compared to USA, but China was growing at a faster rate. So between China and India, there will be relative country convergence. If you think about India, for example, India is probably also going to give you some evidence like that. However, if you think about Democratic Republic of Congo, so income share in 1980s in Democratic Republic of Congo had 5% of U.S. income, whereas in 2007 it is only 1% of U.S. income. So Democratic Republic of Congo was growing at a slower rate on average than the U.S. That's why their income as a share of U.S. income went down. Now, when it comes to these big population countries like China and India, so these countries were also so these two countries in Bangladesh, for example, also included couple of last decades or so. These countries are growing at a much. So when you adjust for this world population, right? India and China, these two countries has 1/3 of the world population, meaning the rest of the if we have in India and China, and the remaining 2 in the rest of the world. So if you adjust, so they have relatively high economic growth and also they have high population. So when you adjust their growth by their population size, so we do have some evidence of um, relative country convergence. I am not sure if someone is trying to talk. Was there anyone trying to talk? Okay, no, I guess not. All right. Now let's talk a little bit about the long-run causes of comparative development. What are the causes that lead to long-run economic growth? So there are different kinds of theories going on in the area in this area involving this area, but two of them are basically the dominant two hypotheses are these two: geography and institution. So the other term that we have here mostly um, you can kind of merge them, or they are not really that dominant. So geography hypothesis basically says that countries are poor or rich. Whether countries are poor or rich depends on their location. So because of their location, some countries are rich and some countries are poor. And the institution hypothesis basically says that it's not geography. What matters is what type of institutions. So if you think about economic institutions, the institution could be of different types: economic institution, political institution, and so on. So economic institution will basically tell you what are the rules and regulations that you have that determines how people behave when it comes to business dealings. Okay.
Sir,
Yes.
can you explain the geography part in brief? Like,
Yes.
how can a geography of a country can tell why it's poor and it's not rich?
So geography, for example, there are some papers. So if you think about Africa, so I think let me go back to the graph that I showed you earlier in this chapter. So most of the developing countries you see, these countries are located near the equator. Meaning these countries are either tropical or subtropical countries. Most of the developing countries, either tropical or subtropical, meaning they are located near the equator, the line passing through the middle of the imaginary line that we have passing through the middle of the earth, where the sun usually remains almost all the time, year round, almost in the uh, on top of our head, for example. So temperature is relatively, so these countries are hot and humid. So there are some. So one scholar in 1748 named Montesquieu basically said that in temperate or cold weather or temperate weather, people are hardworking. They are more vigorous. In hot and humid weather, people are lazy. Like, for example, hot and humid weather would be Bangladesh, India, these places, or African countries. So in these places, people are generally lazy. What do you think?
Well, sir, if you talk about me, I am more lazy in winter. So I don't know. Like,
Well, they, I guess, some would get tired easily as it's like working
So
condition is.
if you're thinking, if you live in an air conditioned environment, it probably is not that big of an issue. But if in summer, did you try to walk around or do something outside in the under the sun?
yeah, it's very difficult.
Right. That's basically what they're trying to say. If you think about the people in who are people who work outside, or even people who work indoor but they don't have air conditioning facilities, think about them working under a roof that has the tin shed buildings or tin shed, some place where they have the tin, the corrugated iron sheet that basically is as used as the top of the building or top of the
Yes, sir.
house. So think about working in that place in the summer. So basically we cannot sleep well. We cannot really concentrate on anything if it is hot and humid.
Sir, what about Japan? Like, there's a record that people there can work for 14 hours, but they still lie in this region.
Yeah, so Japan is kind of a different scenario, different case. So among these Asian countries, so Japan is kind of an exception, I guess.
Sir, then what about Australia? Because what I heard that they have almost very hot weather. So why they are
Some part,
can
yeah,
work?
like some part they have hot weather, but it's yeah. So they have desert, so obviously they will have hot weather in the desert, but it's not like us. Okay,
Yes, sir.
let me see if we can get some temperature chart in different countries. Let's go. Let's see if we can find something like that.
Sir, maybe the humidity fact is a factor.
Obviously, humidity is a big factor, not just a factor. With the same temperature, people in humid area would feel a lot more heat. The temperature that they would feel is going to be much higher than the people in a less humid area.
Yes, sir, it's going to be more exhausting on the body.
Yes. So I'm just trying to see what is how different our weather are. So let's see what we have in Wikipedia. Um, okay, it is probably going to be a little bit rich in Bangladesh. Oh, okay. So I think we probably have to. I have to spend some time to find that thing. It's gonna take some time. So let's move on.
Also, sir, like let's consider Canada. Like they have a very low temperature, and like there's snowfall in severe amount, and
Right.
this some way affects their economy as well. As if like people cannot go out for business, and business doesn't run that well during that time. So doesn't that affect their economy much?
It should affect their economy. But if you think about snowfall versus flood, you know, we have flood, um, we have uh, so the effect of it could be some interesting thing to research, do some research on this. But um, so my understanding is, if uh, okay, let's go back to the geography hypothesis. We're going to talk about this a little bit. So what do you think, geography versus institution? So which one is seem to be more convincing to you?
Institutional quality.
Yes,
So,
sir.
by institutions, do we mean extractive and inclusive political and economical institutions?
By institution, we basically means the rules and regulations that determines how people behave when it comes to economic transactions. For example, it would be economic institutions. Political institutions would define who is going to be in power, who is not going to be in power, which in turn is going to determine the economic institutions. So overall, the rules and regulations, the cultures, the norms that a country has, that determines how people make their decisions, is going. You can think of that those whole thing, rules and regulations, cultural norms, all those things together as the institution. Some institutions are going to be conducive to um, uh, growth. Some institutions are going to be bad for economic growth.
Does it also include the judiciary system?
Yes, if you think about the economic, judiciary system is going to kind of give you the verdict whether something is legal or something is illegal, right? So if you have a
Yes.
corrupt judiciary system, that is going to be a part of a bad institution. Geography is another. So institution versus geography, there are some debate, but you know, when it comes to institution, um, when it comes to geography, so there are some some arguments, or there are some papers that actually explain that because of the indigenous diseases, the malaria in African countries lost nearly about 1.3% of their GDP annually. So they lost economic growth is 1.3% annually in Africa just because of malaria. Malaria is, so malaria would not be people who lives in temperature, they're not going to have malaria. For example, USA, relatively in the cold temperature, you wouldn't see mosquitoes. So there are some indigenous diseases that you'd see mostly in the tropical or subtropical region that is going to affect people's health, which in turn is going to affect the economic growth that you will see. So if someone wants to travel from USA to Bangladesh or this tropical or subtropical region, so CDC, the Center for Disease Control in the US, they have some they have some suggestions or advice that you should get some. You're familiar with jaundice, right? In Bangladesh, they will
Yeah.
ask you to take some vaccine for jaundice. They will ask you to take some medication for malaria, protection from malaria, and so on. So there are a lot of indigenous diseases in tropical and subtropical regions that affect people more frequently. That makes people sick more frequently than the people in the temperate zone. So that will have a negative impact on economic growth, obviously. And an institution, bad institution is obviously, I think it's relatively easy to understand. Bad institution is going to have a negative impact on your economic growth, because if you don't have the proper, if you don't have the, uh, if you don't have good property rights, property right basically means the right to have your own. If you earn something, if you own something, uh, so you deserve to keep it. So if you have poor property rights, someone from, let's say, from a political party leader might come here to confiscate or to um, take it away from you. Or if you think about people doing businesses, if you have to pay a lot of bribe or the fine or fees to other people who are in no way part of the business, but they are going to take it away from you, even by force. If you don't give it willingly, they are going to take it by force. So that would be lack of having property rights. So this sort of lack of property rights are going to are anti-growth, right? That's going to work against this, against people's will to do businesses. So institution, in practice, you will see both the institution and geography will have definitely will impact the economic growth. So let me show you some interesting figure. I think it would be very. This is a really interesting figure that you should see. When it comes to economic, am I presenting? Yeah, I'm presenting. Okay. So let me show you some interesting figures. What is that? Okay, got that. Look at this map. So this was taken by NASA. I hope you know what NASA is, right?
Yes, sir. Of course.
Okay, so this was taken by. So the light that you see, the picture was taken during nighttime. Okay, so the lights that you see represents the light in different places. So this is North Korea and this is South Korea. Do you see any difference here?
Yes, sir. Like they're still working, like, and where North Korea is not, like the country is basically in sleep.
I'm not sure what you meant. Can you repeat that, please?
Well, I mean, so they're still running their industry, so like they're still working, whereas North Korea is in sleep, the whole country.
Okay, so it's not exactly sleeping or not sleeping. The issue here is that, so you have lights here, indicates lots of economic activities and they have electricity. In this part, they don't have that much economic activities going on, and they probably don't even have electricity in most part of the economy. So the light itself basically distinguish between. So this is the line that you see out here. This is called demilitarized zone, DMZ. So basically, the light itself kind of identify the demilitarized zone, and that separates north and south. So geographically, these two countries are located almost at the same place, right? And they were curious. I mean, these two were at some point. These two countries were together, but now they have different economic institutions. I mean, they had different political institutions that led to different economic institutions, which this part was after the Second World War. This part went with Soviet Union, and this part with the U.S. So they Soviet Union gave them a different kinds of economic institution versus the different another kind of institutions in South Korea. And as you can see, the progress that this South Korea made, clearly the light itself can kind of identify uh, that the institution here was not really that conducive to growth versus here. if you think about the cities along the US-Mexico border, there are some cities which, just because of the border itself, even though they are all located almost at the same place, so the border itself separate them, separate these two sides of some cities, and just because of this border, the Mexican part is relatively poorer, whereas the US part is quite rich. Because these two places had different institutions. So the basic idea here is that, I mean, it's not just only institution or only economic growth. Some places institutions played a bigger role than others, and in other places geography was important. An argument against geography. Another argument against geography is something like this. If you think about, for example, Indian subcontinent. In the 1500, not just Indian subcontinent, a lot of Latin American countries were also rich, very rich, compared to currently developed countries. So what is the cause of this reversal of fortune? So what happened? Geographically, their location did not change. So what happened? So that would kind of be an argument against this geography hypothesis. Anyway, so geography plays, obviously, if you think about Nepal or Bhutan versus Bangladesh, geography definitely would play some role here, because Nepal, Bhutan, they are landlocked countries, and Bangladesh is not. So having access to the sea or having a seaport is obviously going to benefit Bangladesh a lot compared to Nepal and Bhutan. So you can say geography can also play a significant role here. And there are some research that actually indicate, if you are, especially I think it was for the research was on China, if a region is located further away from the coastal region, that region is going to be relatively poorer, holding other factors constant, because being close to coastal area means you will have access to the seaport, and you can manufacture goods to export to other goods with relatively lower transportation costs. Okay, so there is a figure that tries to explain all this discussion that we have talked about here. So you should take a look at this and try to understand the concept. I'm not going to repeat it today, so I'm going to leave it up to you to read these things and explain the graph. I'm not going to ask you to memorize this graph. Okay, you don't need to memorize this figure. You have to understand how these links works. So this is the end of our lecture 2. So if you want, we can take a break, and you can take the quiz after the break. So when do you want to take the quiz? So it's 4:08, right? So come back at 4:20, okay?
Yes, sir.
Come back at 4:20, and then you will have about 10 minutes or so for the quiz. All right. So,
Okay.
yeah.